Today's guest, Jimmy Akin, is the Senior Apologist at Catholic Answers, a highly regarded resource hub at Catholic.com, where he's been working since 1993, making him their longest-serving staff member. He's also the host of the wildly popular podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, which captivates around 200,000 listeners as he explores the fascinating mysteries of our world, blending faith, reason, and wonder. What is your perspective on these UFOs and aliens?
Now, some people think that intelligent life must exist only here on Earth, but that's not a teaching of the Christian faith. The Bible doesn't say that. I like the idea of having people living on Mars. I also like the idea of having people living on our sister planet, the Moon, and it is a planet because it's big enough to be round, but it's not big enough to glow.
What was your journey like converting to Catholicism?
Well, so I grew up here in Arkansas, and my parents originally were Church of Christ, which is a conservative Protestant denomination. And when I was about 6 or 7 years old, they had some kind of disagreement with the elders of the church, and so they stopped going. And so after that, I was raised basically nominally Protestant. When I was in my teenage years, I was into the New Age movement. And then when I was 20, I had a profound conversion to Christ, and I wanted to devote my life to studying and teaching God's Word. And as I was educating myself as an adult in the Christian faith, I made it a point to study the theologies of all different groups of Christians, because I realized that what church is within convenient driving distance, and here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, we got 1 million churches. But I realized that, what's within convenient driving distance, or has music I like, or has a preacher I like, or a youth group I like, none of those are good tests for what's theologically true. And that's what I was interested in. So I made a point of studying the theology of all different branches of Christianity, and I would read books by authors of all different perspectives. And one day I was reading a book by a Catholic, and it had a lengthy quotation from Matthew 16, which is the "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church" passage. And even though I had always argued that the rock is not Peter, that it's the revelation that Jesus is the Messiah, and I had ways of arguing that, this particular day, as I was rereading the passage, I noticed there were structural features in the text that are so obvious, they're even there in English. You don't have to go to the Greek. And they required that Peter be the rock. And so I said, well, if Peter's the rock on which Jesus builds his church, and he gives him the keys to the kingdom so that whatever he binds on earth is bound in heaven, and whatever he looses on earth is loosed in heaven, well, then that's going to mean that when Jesus goes back to heaven, Peter's in charge. And whoever is in charge of the earthly church in Jesus' absence, that's a good description of the office of the Pope. And so I said, okay, Catholics are right. Peter's the first Pope. Now, whether there were any later popes, whether that was meant to be an ongoing office, that's a separate question that I still had to investigate. But I realized I had to go back through all the categories of systematic theology with an open mind to the Catholic position. So I was in grad school at the time, and I took a year and basically coasted on my grad school studies while I reinvestigated every category of systematic theology, looking at whether the Catholic position might be correct. And in the end, I concluded it was, and so I became a Catholic.
You recently moved back home to Arkansas from California. After 30 years of being in California, what made you ultimately decide to move?
California did. At the time I left, 40% of the adult population of California was thinking about moving out of state, and I was part of that 40%. As Yakko Warner says in one of their songs, California's great, it's such a lovely state, and every lawn is sitting on a continental plate. The dirt, the rocks, and all those aftershocks, it's just the planet moving granite several city blocks. Only earthquakes are one of the minor problems in California. The major problems are the expense, the politics, the culture, and all of those are pretty hostile to my viewpoints. Also, I had family here in Arkansas. My sister really wanted me to move back, and it was just time to go. And so I'm much, much, much happier back here in Arkansas. It is so not California. It is awesome.
Now, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, a
Mm-hmm.
podcast examining mysteries in the areas of the paranormal and true crime. What was
And
the
a bunch of others.
right?
Mhm.
What was the motivation for starting Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World?
Well, so I've always had an interest in the mysterious and in all different kinds of mysteries. You mentioned true crime and paranormal, but I've also been interested in scientific mysteries, in historical mysteries, in religious mysteries. And I'm on the board of StarQuest Media, which is a Christian podcasting network. And a number of years ago, we were kind of at a decision point in the media. We'd had a separation with some people who'd previously been involved. And when they left, they took their podcasts with them. So we needed to consider, what are we going to be producing now? And as the board, we had a brainstorming meeting, and I said, well, it's hypothetically possible I could do a mystery-based show for us. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for that. That was the start of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. We developed it as a podcast. It's been developed since then because I believe in continuous improvement. When I listen back to episode 1, our production values are really primitive compared to what they are now. But we started the podcast. It's been going for 6 years now, and it became the most popular podcast on the network. We estimate we've got around 200,000 listeners every week.
Do you have a favorite episode that you've made?
Usually the most recent one I've just done. I don't have an overall favorite. There are a lot of really, really good ones that I enjoy, but I don't tend to think in terms of favorites.
Do you have a favorite conspiracy theory or something that you're interested in the most?
Well, my mind tends not to work in terms of favorites, but I do have preferences for certain things over others. So the first thing to say about conspiracy theories is conspiracies are real. That's why we have laws against them. Conspiracy is an agreement between two or more individuals to do something illegal in the future. And that happens a lot. In fact, organized crime is all a network of conspiracies because people are agreeing to do illegal things in the future. We've also had numerous government conspiracies that have been exposed. Watergate was an example of that, or Iran-Contra, or various other things. One thing that's often categorized as a conspiracy theory, although I think it's actually debatable whether it is, was the JF Kennedy assassination. Because there's a debate. Was that just a lone gunman, in which case it wasn't a conspiracy, or did it involve more than a lone gunman? I don't claim to know who killed JFK for sure. I think actually it was just Lee Harvey Oswald is a reasonable position, but I think the idea that there was a conspiracy for which Lee Harvey Oswald was the patsy is also a reasonable position. I think in that case, there's evidence that points both ways. There's also a lot of misinformation in that case that you see in publication. And I've read multiple books and seen multiple documentaries about it. And so that's one that I kind of go back to periodically because I don't have a settled position on that one.
How do you achieve such an impressive beard? Any tips for growing one like that?
Stop cutting it. That's basically what I did. I stopped shaving. Then I stopped cutting my beard, and it grew out at about a rate of an inch a month for a year. And then I thought it was done, but then when COVID hit, it got even longer. So I don't know, it kind of goes down to my belly button. You can't really see that. But that's all I did really. Now, one thing someone might try is, and I don't know if this would work for them or not, but they might try taking biotin. Biotin is a B vitamin that is claimed to be connected to hair and fingernail growth. And so you might try some biotin if you wanted to get a longer effect than what you're able to do without it.
This is kind of a long question here. On June 25th, 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released the 9-page unclassified report. It focused on 144 observations of unidentified aerial phenomenon, mostly from U.S. Navy personnel from 2004 to 2021. In July of 2023, top members of the intelligence community testified before Congress, also confirming the existence of UFOs and confirming that what the Navy videos show are still unexplained. The government has never claimed they are of extraterrestrial origin. And then recently, November 13th, 2024, another UFO hearing took place. And in addition to that, there have been reports of drones flying over New Jersey, New York, and then this morning I checked, there was a drones over a U.S. airbase in Germany. So
also Southern California and Australia and all over the place. Yeah.
I didn't know about the Australia. Okay. So I guess with all that being said, a popular view among Christians is that while UFOs are real, they are not physical aliens from another planet. Rather, they are demonic spirits that are attempting to deceive people and draw them away from the truth of the gospel. Or maybe these UFOs are just advanced technology from the government or another country. So I guess my question would be, what is your perspective on these UFOs and aliens?
Well, I'm open to wherever the evidence goes. If now some people think that intelligent life must exist only here on Earth, but that's not a teaching of the Christian faith. The Bible doesn't say that. It says that humans are the image of God here on Earth. We represent God to the creatures on this world. We're his regent to rule the planet in his stead. That's what being his image means. But we know God has created other intelligent beings because he created the angels. They're intelligent beings. They're just non-physical. But if he made non-physical intelligences like angels, and if he made physical intelligences like us, he could make physical intelligences elsewhere, and they'd just be more children of God. So if he chose to make intelligent life on other planets, Christian faith doesn't have any problem with that. But the question is, what evidence do you have? Well, we've got some things flying around in the skies that we don't know what they are. And some of them seem to have advanced flight capabilities that we don't know how to duplicate. So what might they be? Well, they might be aliens from elsewhere in this universe. They might be from an adjacent physical dimension. They might be time travelers from the future or even the past. They might be a classified government American program. They might be produced by one of our nation-state competitors like Russia or China. They might be some natural phenomenon we haven't identified yet, and they might be demons. They might be any of those things. So I'm open to whatever the evidence suggests. What I'm not in favor of is leaping to the demon hypothesis, because there are a few things that are inconsistent. Well, there are several reasons. One is there are some things about the UAPs or UFOs that have been filmed and so forth, or that have been reported, that are inconsistent with known demonic behavior. If you say they're here to deceive us, so why aren't they talking more? Just flying around, how does that deceive anybody? That just raises a question. Oh, I wonder what that thing is. That doesn't deceive anybody. And, there are reports of aliens talking to people. There have been such reports going all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, when there was a movement known as the contactees, who were people like George Adamski who claimed to be in contact with aliens. And they were all a bunch of liars. They were hoaxers. There's no credibility to those reports. So in terms of credible reports of something genuinely anomalous happening, they're pretty rare, and they don't involve substantial communication. So they're not really behaving like demons behave either in the Bible, where they mostly possess people, or in church history, where again, they mostly possess people, and we don't see credible accounts of aliens possessing people. So that's one reason that we want to be a little skeptical of just assuming they're demons. Another reason is it makes us look like idiots because we're not considering other possibilities that are legitimate and need to be considered. If you have a range of possibilities that could explain a phenomenon, and let's take it out of the UAP realm. Let's just say someone has an illness. They've got a set of symptoms, and you name, like I named, 6 or 7 different things that could explain UFOs. Well, if you've got someone who has a set of symptoms, they've got some kind of illness, and you say, well, here's one possibility of what it could be, here's another possibility, here's another, and you name 6 or 7 of these, it's evidentially mistaken to just latch on to one of them because that's what you're familiar with and say, oh, it must be that, when it could equally well be these others. If someone's got an illness, I say, here are 7 things it could be. We need to do more tests. And someone says, no, it must be number 7. We don't need to do any tests. We don't need to investigate further. Well, that person's an idiot, and you shouldn't be going to that person as a doctor. Because if there are 7 different things that could explain it, and you haven't investigated which one it would be, then you're not really being fair with the evidence. You're just advancing an assumption you're making, not supported by the evidence. And for Christians to do that makes them look ridiculous to non-Christians, and that harms the cause of evangelization. And that's something we need to be concerned about. St. Paul in Romans talks about how, to some of his audience, he says, God's name is blasphemed because of you, because you're doing things that are scandalous to people who are not yet believers. You're harming the cause of evangelization. You're driving people away from God by what you're doing. And in the same way, in 1 Corinthians, he talks about how if you're all speaking in tongues and an outsider comes in, he's going to think you're out of your minds. And so again, we need to be concerned about what impression are we given to people who don't share the faith. We need to present the Christian faith as a reasonable, intelligent, enterprise where you look at the data and you follow the data. You don't just assume it's some scandalous, dramatic sounding thing just because that's what you're familiar with. So I'm open when it comes to aliens. Maybe some of them are demons, but I need to see evidence for that. I also need to see evidence that some of them are aliens. I don't know that's the case either. In fact, that's one of the perplexing things about this field is what's being reported in terms of the actual reports that are credible is difficult to explain. But there are several possibilities, and we just need more data to figure it out.
I've heard this term thrown around lately. Mm-hmm. It's called immaculate constellation.
Yes.
What does that even mean?
Okay, so this is one of the things that came out of the congressional hearings that were held in November of 2024. Basically, a journalist who participated in those briefings presented a report that had been written by someone connected with the government or Defense Department. He wouldn't say who. The person wanted anonymity. He said that they were a current or former employee of the government, I guess, and they had learned, among other things, because the report covered several different things, but one of the things they'd uncovered is an unacknowledged special access program called Immaculate Constellation, which was created after 2017, which was when the New York Times, broke the story about the declassified UFO videos that, I'm sure your listeners have seen. And after it was admitted that there was a UFO study program within the Defense Department, this program got created that came to be called Immaculate Constellation. That's job was to hoover up principally imagery connected with UFO encounters and keep it away from congressional oversight. So the idea is that things in the Defense Department need to be under civilian control. Here in the United States, we're not a military dictatorship. The military responds and reports to civilian government. Now, they do that in the sense that the president is the commander-in-chief of the military, and the president's a civilian, but also Congress is supposed to have oversight of what's going on in the Defense Department. And so there are special access programs that you need, certain clearances to be briefed about, but they're supposed to be acknowledged to Congress because there are people in Congress who have the requisite classifications to be briefed on this, like in the various military committees and budgetary committees and so forth. And they're supposed to know about what you're doing. So you're not supposed to create unacknowledged special access programs where you've got a program and you're not telling Congress about it. And the report is that's what Immaculate Constellation is. It's a program that was created to, among other things, collect imagery that has come to the attention of the Defense Department about UAPs and keep that imagery away from congressional oversight. So it's operated in an illegal manner. Now, you may wonder about the name Immaculate Constellation. The way government program names work is you don't want to give your program a name to where you can easily figure out what the classified program is. Like back during World War II, when they were building the atomic bomb, they didn't call it Project Atomic Bomb, because they didn't want foreign spies like the Nazis or the Russians figuring out what it was. So instead of calling it Project Atomic Bomb, they called it Project Manhattan. And they've basically followed that principle to today. So today what happens is when you have a classified program, it typically gets a 2-name designation. And they actually have a computer generate 2 lists of names, and you pick one item from each list. So, for example, the Defense Department Psychic Spying Program that existed between the 1970s and the 1990s, it was at various points called things like Grill Flame. So they saw grill is in one list, flame is in the other list. They call it Grill Flame. And then they have to change the name every few years so that foreign spies don't figure out how to penetrate it. You want to keep it a little evasive, so you change the name every few years. And then they changed it to Center Lane. And then a few years later, they changed it to Stargate. Then they had the name before the movie and the TV show. Well, apparently, in coming up with this classified imagery program, they had the 2 lists of names. Immaculate was on one, Constellation was on the other, and so they decided to call it Immaculate Constellation. And they probably thought, oh, that sounds cool. It sounds kind of like Immaculate Conception, but it's got the word constellation in there, and that's kind of spacey, so we'll call it Immaculate Constellation. The good thing about that name is it now gives us something to do inquiries about. Because if you've got an unacknowledged special access program, well, they're not acknowledging it. They're not telling you about it. And that makes it hard to do queries of the Defense Department and say, so tell us about this thing, we don't know its name. Well, they're going to say, sorry, we don't have any record of your no-name thing. But if you can say, tell us everything you know about Immaculate Constellation, that makes it easier to get at any records that may exist about this thing, if it exists. The reporter who presented this report to Congress, and the report is available, it's on the congressional website in at least a couple of places. Nancy Mace of South Carolina has it on hers, but if you just Google Immaculate Constellation UAP report, it'll come up and you can download it and read it. It is not all about Immaculate Constellation, but that is one of the things in it. But the reporter who presented this to Congress indicated, per good journalism, you don't just want one source for something. He said he does know the author of the report. He checked him out. He did hold the positions, or does hold the positions claimed, and he got confirmation from multiple other sources that Immaculate Constellation is real. And so that's what you're supposed to do in good journalism. You don't run with something when just one source tells it to you. But he says he's actually got multiple sources saying this is a real program.
According to Live Science, in 2019, there have been more than 10,000 eyewitness accounts of Bigfoot in the continental United States in the last 50 years. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, BFRO, has received nearly 75,000 reports of Bigfoot sightings, but only considers 5,000 to 6,000 of them to be credible. What are your thoughts on the cultural impact and implications of the Bigfoot legend in today's society?
Well, so I grew up in the 1970s, and it had a notable impact back then. I remember, watching Bigfoot documentaries on TV. The famous Patterson-Gimlin film was like 1967, 1968, and so in the 1970s, that was a big deal. You'd see that in all the Bigfoot documentaries. There were also movies here about Bigfoot set here in Arkansas, like The Legend of Boggy Creek, and it had 2 sequels. And there were other Bigfoot movies too. So it had a notable cultural impact then, but it's even bigger now because I'm driving down the road, I'm seeing other people's, SUVs and stuff, and they've got Bigfoot stickers on them. Or I'll be driving down the road and there'll be a little country store and they've got a big Sasquatch silhouette standing out in front, or maybe a statue or something like that. So it is just all over the place now. And there are not just occasional documentaries, there are ongoing TV shows and podcasts, and it's a really big thing. So it's had a major cultural impact that has grown over time. Now, did you want me to tell you what I think about Bigfoot, or did you just want me to comment on the cultural impact?
Well, yeah, I watched an interview with Pints with Aquinas. I think, well, he changed his, I guess, back to Matt, his name, the YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in that podcast that you kind of changed your mind on it, or maybe you somewhat because of the muscle structure in that Patterson-Gimlin film. Is that correct?
Well, that's kind of that's part of what happened. So one of the things I did, and this was like episode 3 of Mysterious World, and the show was much more primitive then than it is now, but I wanted to cover Bigfoot early because it's something people are interested in, and it's something that, there's no problem with the faith. If God created another creature here on Earth, I mean, that's no skin off the face knows, so there's no problem with it. And the evidence is intriguing, but and I'd love for Bigfoot to be real. But my conclusion in that show was, even though I'm open, that it's probably not real, because what that would mean is that there is not just one of these creatures, but there is a breeding population of these creatures that has managed to remain undiscovered in North America. And that's a problem. The idea that there are undiscovered animals or cryptids, that's not a problem. We know there are lots of undiscovered animals, but most of them here in the U.S., where we have lots of scientists and lots of trail cameras and things like that, they tend to be smaller. It's not like people aren't finding a new species of moose, periodically. Moose are big organisms, and we've kind of got enough eyeballs on North America that, it's hard for there to be a large creature that remains undiscovered. If you want to say you found a new species of lizard or a new species of pill bug or a new species of bacteria, that's easy. But normally where larger creatures get discovered is in parts of the world that are less populated, like Southeast Asia in the jungle, or in the middle of Australia, or where there aren't that many people, or stuff like that, or in the ocean, where there aren't any people living on a regular basis. So you can find larger undiscovered creatures in those places, but it's just hard to see how would you have a larger than human mammalian breeding population here in the United States, and yet that remains undiscovered. So that's a challenge. And, and my initial conclusion was I think that it's very probably not real. And I thought the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is the one where Bigfoot's walking across the creek bed and turns and looks back, it's the basis of the famous silhouettes that you see on people's SUVs and in front of country stores and so forth. I thought that film was a fake. But I've since done more research, and I'm not as convinced that the Patterson-Gimlin film is a fake. There was some bad data I had encountered, and so I'm not as convinced. Part of my reevaluation of this area does involve the musculature that you can see rippling underneath the fur in the Patterson-Gimlin film. If that's a costume, it's really hard. It's an anomalous costume for 1967. I mean, you look at actual Hollywood costumes of the day, like Planet of the Apes. I'm sorry, not Planet of the Apes. 2001: A Space Odyssey, where they were trying to do realistic ape-like costumes. You look at that today, and it's clear these are guys in suits. Costume technology was not that developed, and this would be an anomalously good costume if it's a costume. But it's not just that. There's a whole bunch of other evidence, including physical evidence regarding Bigfoot, that I was not aware of. I'd recommend a particular book for people who would like exposure to this evidence so they can evaluate it for themselves. The book is called Sasquatch. It's by a researcher named Jeff Meldrum. And he, if I recall correctly, he's a physical anthropologist, but he surveys different categories of evidence. He does talk about the Patterson-Gimlin film, but he talks about a lot more, including footprints. Now, a lot of footprints are fake, but there are some footprints that are really hard to explain as fakes, in part because sometimes the footprints are found in media that give you a really, really clear print. In fact, to the point that you can look at the dermal ridges that are on the foot. So humans have dermal ridges, we call them fingerprints and toe prints and so forth. We have ridges in our skin, so they're dermal ridges. We've got them on our hands and on our feet on the undersides. We don't have them on the backs of our hands or the tops of our feet, but we've got them on the undersides. And their function, because we grew up, or our ancestors grew up swinging from the trees, well, if you're swinging around in the trees, you don't want a slippery hand. You want a hand that has not only the ability to grasp the branch, which is why we have opposable thumbs, you want there to be friction so that you can grab on to the branch and not just slip off of it. And that's why we have dermal ridges. They increase the friction of things we grab onto. It's also the reason that when you stand in water, your fingers and toes wrinkle. People sometimes, I remember hearing as a kid explanations like, oh, that means the oil has leached out of your skin. No, that's wrong. That is a reflex. If you put your hands or feet in water, you have a reflex that will cause them to wrinkle. And the reason, again, is to create more friction. Because if your skin is all wrinkled, it has more friction when you rub it against something. And so, like if you're standing in a stream, you want your toes to wrinkle up so that you don't slip and fall on the rocks. So that's why we have dermal ridges. Well, it so happens that in some Bigfoot footprints, the medium that whatever it was stepped in was fine enough. We can see the dermal ridges, and they get preserved when you take a plaster cast. So we actually have Bigfoot dermal ridges. And among the things we can see is this foot is flexible. It is not just a board that has been carved. I mean, there are fake board-made footprints, but there are also footprints where you can see the shape of this overly large foot is adapted to the surface it's walking on, which is what our feet do. You know, if you walk over an uneven surface, your foot adapts to what you're walking on, so you don't fall over. Well, we can tell these feet, whatever made them, were, you know, these footprints, whatever made them, the feet were adapting to the structures they're walking on. They're not just rigid boards. And we can then see the dermal ridges, and across different exemplars. So this is from different times and places. We see common characteristics in the dermal ridges that are different than human ones. So with humans, with our feet, we tend to have horizontal ridge lines going across our feet. We also have that on our hands. We've got these horizontal lines going across our hands, but on the Bigfoot prints, they tend to go vertically. And so we've got something. It's a footprint. It was made by something adaptive to the medium it's walking on. It's deep enough. It looks like it was made by something several hundred pounds heavier than a typical human. It has dermal ridges, and these dermal ridges are different than the ones we find on humans, and it's super big. So this would be an example of physical evidence that is consistent with the Bigfoot hypothesis and is otherwise difficult to explain, because it's not easy to otherwise. I mean, it would be really hard to fake this. It might be possible, but how exactly would you do it, especially given the weight that was needed to produce the depth that some of these are found at? So I've had to rethink my position on Bigfoot, not to the point of I'm a convinced Bigfoot believer, because I still think how do you explain an adult larger than human mammalian species in North America that has remained undiscovered for a whole breeding population? I think that is that's still a challenge that has to be overcome. But I am more open to the idea of Bigfoot existing now than I used to be.
Something strange that when people claim to see Bigfoot, they also claim to see like an orb or something like that.
There are some reports like that, yeah.
Do you think it's possible that Bigfoot could be like demonic in any way?
Well, so is it possible? Well, sure, anything's possible, but what evidence do you have for that? If you see Bigfoot and a glowing orb, I mean, if you see either Bigfoot or a glowing orb, why do you assume either one of those is a demon? And therefore, why, if you see them both together, why do you assume there's a demon involved? I can also explain the same reports in other ways. For example, if you're out in the woods and you think you see a Bigfoot and you think you see a glowing orb, okay, how do you know it wasn't a bear? And how do you know it wasn't a will-o'-the-wisp? You know, that it wasn't just, or ball lightning or something like that, because there are naturally occurring phenomena that are like glowing orbs. So yeah, it could be a demon, but I want to see evidence before I entertain that hypothesis, when there are other hypotheses that also need to be looked at and that better fit the data. You know, there are not very many cases of Bigfoot possessing people, and that's the primary form of demonic manifestation we find both in the Bible and church history.
SpaceX, a company founded by Elon Musk, has plans to colonize Mars. These plans include building a city that can house 1 million people within 20 years, designing spacesuits, researching human reproduction, using reusable transportation, and they want to establish a citizen-led government. Musk's motivation for colonizing Mars is the belief that it will help ensure the long-term survival of the human species. However, some scientists say that the reality of life on Mars would be bleaker than people might think. So my question would be, should Christians support space exploration and colonization on other planets?
Well, I think in principle, sure. We have space exploration going on right now, and it's contributed to our culture here on Earth. For every dollar that was invested in the NASA program, our economy grew by a bunch as a result of spin-off technologies. And, that happened with the space program in the 60s and before that in the 50s. And, reinvesting in space technology is something that, based on historical precedent, should help us grow our economy further, especially if we go to places like the asteroid belt and start mining them for resources, because there are various metals, they're often called rare earth metals, that do exist on Earth, but they're not that common, but we need them for our phones and other technologies. In fact, there are metal pirates today, thieves that specifically target certain metals because of how valuable they are. And we're not talking gold and silver. We're talking, copper, and we're talking ytterbium and neodymium and things like that. And so, since a lot of these are scarce here on Earth, finding them in the asteroid belt and bringing them back, because the asteroids are largely stony metallic, that would help grow Earth's economy. It would make us all richer. There are lots of resources out there. And so I don't see any reason not to go get them and not to do scientific research and things like that. Mars is kind of an interesting case. I like the idea of having people living on Mars. I also like the idea of having people living on our sister planet, the moon. And it is a planet because it's big enough to be round, but it's not big enough to glow. That's the rule. If it's big enough to be round, but it doesn't glow, so it's not a star, well, it's a planet. So guess what? We're living in a double planet system with our twin planet, the moon. Well, I like the idea of people living on the moon. I like the idea of people living on Mars. I like the idea of people living places. So I don't see any reason not to do it. Now, I understand from a secular perspective that if you don't believe in God and you're not a Christian and you don't think Jesus is going to come back someday, then you're going to be worried about things like asteroid impacts ending the human race here on Earth. And you don't want the human race to go extinct, so you want extraplanetary colonies. Well, okay, fine. I understand that position. As a Christian, I don't think the human race is going to end in one of these ways. I think, God's going to come back at some point and bring the earth to consummation. However, that doesn't mean in the interim we're not going to have an asteroid strike. And so I think having some of our eggs not all in the same basket is a good strategy in general, because we could have planetary disasters that, even if they don't end the human race, it could be good to have some backups elsewhere in the solar system that can help us rebuild in the event. Also, the mere fact that we establish colonies off Earth is going to mean technological developments that are going to make it easier to deal with things like asteroid strikes and prevent them from happening. So I don't see any reason that Christians should, hide their heads in the sand and say, we don't want to have anything to do with space exploration. I think God gave us, this realm to explore and manage on his behalf. And I think it's an exciting adventure.
Someone asked you this question 4 years ago. I thought it was very interesting.
Oh.
The question,
I won't remember it, but okay.
It has to do with kind of this. It said, if people move to Mars, die, and are buried there, when the end times come and they are in their glorified body, will they be living on Mars, back on Earth with the rest of us, or someplace else?
That's entirely up to God. The way the Bible presents it is mankind will be living in the new heavens and the new earth with God. I suspect that the future state of mankind in the eternal order exceeds our ability to imagine. So it may be all of the various proposals that get made may be oversimplifications. I suspect, because we're told we're going to reign and rule with God. We're not just going to be sitting on clouds playing harps. We're going to be doing stuff. What that stuff is, I don't know. But it may well involve travel off Earth, because one of the things, now this is not church teaching, but it's theological speculation. But one of the things that that theologians have speculated on for a long time is that if mankind had not fallen, he would have had what are known in theology as preternatural gifts. They're basically superpowers. But the idea is that God created mankind in a state of what theologians referred to as elevated nature, where he not only had the gift of original holiness, he also had these preternatural gifts that included things like agility. In theological language, agility basically is the same thing as what today we would call teleportation. So you could just think of the place you wanted to be, and instantly you would be there. And so, you have very well-respected theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s talking about these preternatural gifts. More recently, you've had theologians like Father Alois Weisinger, who was a Cistercian abbot in the 20th century, who have speculated that maybe that's what psychic powers are, that they're the remnants of the preternatural gifts that, even though they stopped functioning the way they should when we fell into sin, there's still little remnants of them. And they may manifest even more when we're in the intermediate state between death and resurrection, so we're not encumbered by our bodies. And then we'll have the preternatural gifts back fully when we're in our resurrected form. So like Jesus could teleport through walls, like when he gets out of the tomb, as it's been pointed out, the angel comes down and rolls away the rock, not to let Jesus out, but to let the women see in. Jesus was already gone. He got out of a locked tomb. And then he shows up to the disciples when they've got the doors locked, and he nevertheless appears there. So Jesus is teleporting around. In parapsychology, this is a phenomenon known as apportation. If something suddenly appears, it has apported, and we have evidence for human apportation in the New Testament. We're also told in the New Testament we're going to be like Jesus, for we will see him as he is. And so if he can apport or teleport, and then we may be able to apport or teleport too. And so we may not be confined to being here on Earth. You want to find out what it's like on Mars, you may be able to teleport yourself to Mars and find out under God's providence. So who knows?
What is the Chronovisor?
Okay. The Chronovisor is a long-standing rumor about a device. Now, Chronos in Greek was the god of time, and visor is kind of Latinate, it's where we get the word vision. And so the idea of a chronovisor was it's a device that allows you to view different times, and so kind of like a time television. They had a device like this once on Doctor Who back in the old days, where you could tune in on some distant place and time. And that's the idea behind the Chronovisor. The claim is that this device actually exists and that it was built by a priest connected with the Vatican. The priest that this is attributed to is a real guy. He did really exist. But we don't have good evidence that this actually happened. I think this is all a big hoax. If you want to learn more about it, though, and he claimed to do things like view the crucifixion and view other historical incidents and so forth. But if you want to learn about this, it's in episode 299 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So you can go find that by just going to mysterious.fm/299. and learn all about the Chronovisor and hear all the interesting claims. And then ultimately I have to come in and be a party pooper and tell you I don't think it's real.
You've debated notable figures like Bart Ehrman, William Lane Craig, Dr. Hugh Ross, and Gavin Ortlund, and you expressed a desire to debate James White on the topic of Sola Scriptura. And that opportunity came to fruition I think it was about 6 months ago, maybe 7 months ago. What made James White and the subject of Sola Scriptura your top choice for debate at that time?
Well, I had some exchanges with him that were, in not. One was a formal debate, one was an informal debate, but back in the 1990s. So I'd debated him before. I'd also seen other people debate him on Sola Scriptura, which is one of the key claims that he relies on. The idea is that everything needs to be stated or all Christian belief needs to be stated or implied in the Bible. And I've seen him debate other people with that, but I thought, I can do better. I thought that there are aspects of this question that could be handled better, and I've seen other people debate him and not handle it as well as I think it could be done. So I thought I had something to contribute on that subject, and that's why I wanted to debate him on it.
In that debate with James White, you said you have Francis on speed dial. Were you joking, or do you talk to Francis often?
Francis doesn't really speak English that great, so no, I don't literally have Pope Francis on speed dial. But if he ever wants to talk, I'm happy to.
Is there a opponent or a topic that you want to debate in the future?
Well, I kind of take it, I kind of take it as it comes. I end up doing a number of debates, typically a few every year these days. I'm not overly, I'm kind of selective about what debates I do. One debate that I think is intriguing is one that Bart Ehrman actually proposed. He and I debated the reliability of the Gospels, and he was a very gracious guy. It was a friendly debate. And I deliberately tried to keep it friendly. And I was recently watching a YouTube video that had him as an interviewee, and one of the things they were doing in the interview, he was responding to, this was on Paulogia's channel, and Paulogia was playing some clips from Bart's and my debate, and also some clips from me afterwards talking about the debate. And then he was getting Bart's reaction to those. And Bart was very gentlemanly. He was very gracious, but he was also there to promote a course he was doing on Acts, the book of Acts. And Bart just kind of offhandedly said, "Oh, maybe Jimmy and I can debate the historical reliability of that." And I'm actually quite open to that. I love the book of Acts. I've done a lot of work on it and its history. And I mean, it's how it works as a historical document. So Bart has a very high appraisal of the literary qualities of the work. He thinks that the author was a genius, and I would agree. But he has a different valuation than I do of its historical reliability. I think it's very historically reliable, and I actually use it as a framework for I'm a biblical chronology geek, and so I use Acts as a chronological framework for basically the period from AD 33 to AD 60, and I fit Paul's epistles into the structure of Acts and things like that. So I think it's possible to do a lot of really interesting historical work with Acts. Bart has a different appraisal, and so I think that would be something fun to debate.
How do you prepare for a debate?
Well, the first thing I do is I decide, is this debate going to be worth my time? Because in order to do a debate well, you got to devote time to it. You don't go in half-cocked. There's a major investment of time anytime you do a debate. And so I want to make sure that a given debate is going to be productive. That means there are certain debates with certain people that I normally wouldn't consider. For example, I'm not the Orthodox Christian teaching about Christ's will is known as diotheletism. Thelema is Greek for will. Dio is from duo, which means two, and so the teaching is Christ has two wills. He's got a divine will and a human will. Historically, there was another position known as monothelitism, which means he has only one will. And that's not the Orthodox way of articulating the faith. So I, as an Orthodox, believing Christian, I'm a diothelite. I believe Christ had two wills, one divine and one human. Well, that's something that I could debate with a monothelite. But I'm not going to debate that with a Jehovah's Witness, because Jehovah's Witnesses don't even believe that Jesus is God. So if they don't even believe that Jesus is God, they're not going to credence the idea that he might have a divine will. So it would make sense for me to debate, does he have one will or two, with someone who at least believes he's got two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. It would make no sense to debate that with someone who does not believe he's got a divine nature, like a Jehovah's Witness. For them, the real question that should be debated is, does Jesus have a divine nature? Is he really God? But debating, does he have two wills, that doesn't make sense with a Jehovah's Witness, because our starting points are too far apart. And so there are some issues I would debate with an Eastern Orthodox person, like, was Mary assumed into heaven, or was she immaculately conceived? I'm less likely to debate that with a Protestant because their starting point is farther apart. Because where the Catholic Church draws her certainty about some of the Marian doctrines is not Scripture alone. It's Scripture with tradition as understood by the magisterium. And so the real issue that needs to be debated there with a Protestant is sola scriptura. What authority should we use when we're formulating Christian doctrine? Once you have that, then it makes sense to proceed to some of these subsidiary questions. But it kind of doesn't make sense to debate the Immaculate Conception with a Protestant the same way it doesn't make sense to debate the two wills of Christ with someone who doesn't even think he has a divine nature. So I try to figure out, is this going to be a productive debate? And then if I conclude yes, and I've agreed to the debate, then I do a review of the literature, including specifically what my opponent has said on this subject before. So like when I debated Bart Ehrman, I watched every debate that I could find that Ehrman had done on related subjects, just so I'd know what his thought is, what he's likely to bring up. When I debated James White, I watched every debate I could find of James White, talking on the subjects that, and even non-debates, but just other talks he had made on the subjects that we were going to be debating. So I understand the shape of the thought, what arguments my opponent is going to use or is likely to use, what they may bring up, what objections they may bring up. And I then work my way through all that material and make sure I have I have responses to everything my opponent is likely to say. And then I also formulate my own positive case. And as part of doing that, I try to bulletproof it. What I mean by that is I try to remove all of the weak elements, because arguments on a given subject have different levels of effectiveness in terms of their evidential force. And you've got very limited amount of time in a formal debate structure. I mean, really, even though the event may last a couple hours or, 2 to 3 hours, the time that you're in control where you get to speak and present your case and respond to your opponent is very limited. It may only be like 30 minutes total or something when you take out audience questions and cross-examination and your opponent's time and stuff like that. And so you've got to present a really compressed case, and I figure out what are the most important points that really need to be made here, and then I let all the rest go. And I prepare my case. These days I use slides, so I prepare a case for that I'm going to present using a slideshow. And I think very carefully about what are the most important must-use arguments, and then anything that is not on that top level, I I put it to one side. If it comes up in cross-examination or something, that's fine, but I'm not going to waste my time or my audience's time by presenting them B-tier arguments when I need to be giving them the A-tier arguments.
Many people often express, I don't know what my talent is. I wish I could discover it. So, how can someone uncover their true talents?
Well, so obviously you can pray about it, but and I would encourage people to do that. But I think God wants us to do more than pray a lot of the times. And so if someone is trying to uncover their own talents, now you have to be open. If God wants to give you a miraculous gift like speaking in tongues, there's no real way to predict is he going to do that. You just have to be open to that. But I would say look at your own inclinations. And, what do you feel attracted to? Do you feel attracted to leading a Bible study or participating in a Bible study? Or do you feel attracted to volunteering in a soup kitchen? Or do you feel attracted to both? Look at things, look at your own inclinations, and then look at your track record. What have I been good at in the past? And then experiment, try stuff out. Maybe you want to go take a class on if you want to lead a Bible study, maybe you want to start one in your home, or maybe you want to go get some education before you do that and take a class about the Bible so you can share that knowledge with others. But basically, I would say in addition to praying, look at your inclinations and what you're interested in as a guide for what you might be good at, and then get some experience. You don't have to be perfect starting out, but start trying. See if you get some success that can grow over time and you can cultivate that talent. Because a general rule when it comes to learning any skill is in order to be really good, you got to be really bad for a good while. No one starts out playing the violin at virtuoso level, but that doesn't mean you can't become a violin virtuoso. The way you find out is you say, okay, am I attracted to the idea of playing the violin? Do I think that would be fun to do? And then you get a violin and you start getting some experience. You start taking some lessons. You see how rapidly you progress or don't. Is it a frustrating experience for you more than it's a pleasurable experience? So, big believer in experiment based on what your suspicions are based on your inclinations.
And Jimmy, one of your talents is speaking and teaching. Did you practice that, or do you think you were born with it, or maybe a little bit of both?
Well, I think with any skill, there's some degree of inbuilt talent that then gets cultivated through experience. Now, I've been, I do think that I have some native teaching ability, which I think that God has elevated, for His purposes. I think that of all the spiritual gifts, the one that I would claim to have is teaching. It's something that is not just done in a spiritual context, because I also teach other stuff besides just religious content. Mysterious World is an example of that. And even in a religious context, people will ask me questions that don't have to do with religion, like, how do stars make elements? I got that question from a 12-year-old girl once on Catholic Answers Live, and I knew exactly, okay, here's how stars make elements. I told her. And I also teach several forms of dance. So I think I have a native teaching ability, and both of my parents were also teachers. So I kind of grew up in a teaching environment, but I think I have some native teaching ability that I've then worked on. I was a teacher in grad school. In fact, I won teaching awards in grad school. And I've taught ever since. So I've been doing apologetics now for going on 32 years. And in 32 years of talking about stuff, if you're doing it right, well, then you learn something. So yeah, it's been something that's been developed over time.
One of the most common arguments posed by atheists is, if God is truly all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly loving, then why does evil exist? Why do atrocities like murder and events such as the Holocaust occur? How would you respond to this?
Well, it depends on the amount of time that the person wants me to talk about it. I could write a whole book about this is known in philosophy and theology as the problem of evil. If God is good, why is there evil? And so what I have to do is scale my response to the allotted time. In fact, if you want a broader response, then I can give in just the brief kind of Q&A format we're doing at the moment. I've actually got some talks on this. If you go to shop.catholic.com, there's a DVD talk on the problem of evil. Also, if you go to my YouTube channel, there is a talk called If God Exists, Why Do I Suffer?, which looks specifically at the problem of evil that deals with physical evil or suffering, as opposed to moral evil or sin. Those are really the two kinds of evil, physical evil and moral evil, or sin and suffering. So I have a whole talk on my YouTube page on the physical problem of evil. But the basic answer from a Catholic perspective, to why do both forms of evil exist, is not that God wants them for their own sake. He doesn't. That's why he's good. But he tolerates them for the sake of greater good. And according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, God would not allow any evil to exist, moral or physical, unless he was going to bring about an equal or greater good out of that evil. So any evil you want to name, God is going to bring some equal or greater good out of it. The obvious big case of this is the crucifixion itself. That was getting crucified, that's a big evil. But God brought about, and crucifying God's son, that's even worse. But God, despite that evil, brought about the greatest good in the form of the redemption of the world. So that's an example of God using an evil to bring about a good. Well, the same thing is going to be true in our own lives and in the lives of others. So if murder and other atrocities exist, as bad as those are, the Christian conviction is ultimately God is only tolerating that in order to allow some greater good to occur. We can then speculate on what is that greater good, and we may or may not be able to get to a satisfactory resolution in this life, because in this life we have limited information. I often compare the situation to that of a small child who is being taken by his parents to the doctor to get his childhood inoculations. Because I remember when this happened to me, when I'm a little small child and my parents take me to the doctor, and all of a sudden these people who love me and take care of me have brought me to this strange place that smells funny, and there are these strange people, and they're going to stick a metal object into my body. And it's, what is going on? This is wrong. This is terrible. I'm frightened. It's going to hurt. I'm screaming. And there's physical evil being done here in the form of the suffering of the fear and the pain of getting a shot. But what I, as a small child, don't know is this is going to spare me from really horrible diseases later that would cause a lot more suffering and that could even kill me. And so I'm not going to get disfigured by polio or crippled by polio or things like that, like my grandmother's generation did. And so there is a reason to tolerate this brief momentary pain that's caused by the shot because of the good that's going to come afterwards. And as an adult, I understand that, but as a kid, I don't. And we're in basically that position with respect to God. We can't see the full picture right now, and so that means we're operating with limited information. In some cases, we can make pretty good guesses about why does God allow certain classes of evil, like sin. Well, if he didn't allow sin to occur, he'd have to eliminate the kind of free will that allows people to freely choose whether or not to love. And love, we know, is God's highest priority because it's the two great commandments. The first great commandment is love God. The second great commandment is love your neighbor. And so love is God's highest priority, but he wants it to be freely chosen. He doesn't just want to have robotic pre-programmed love. And so if he's going to allow people to freely choose love, then he has to allow them to have free will, or to use a little bit more of a philosophical term, libertarian free will. But if you give someone libertarian free will, they may misuse it. They may act in an unloving way. And acting in an unloving way, that's what sin is. So we've got a pretty good, at least general guess for why God allows sin. It's to allow love to be freely chosen. But if you ask why some particular sin, well, there will be something good that's going to come out of it, but it can be harder to figure out. One thing we know, though, is that no one's going to end up in the negative column from suffering or from sin. As St. Paul says, and he talks about this in Romans and also in 1 Corinthians, God has this amazing future for us. Death is not the end. And so if we're faithful and we're loving people, then we're going to go to heaven and we're going to have an eternity of goodness. And that more than outweighs anything that we experienced in this life. It's kind of like in the childhood injection example. When you're a little kid, getting an injection seems like a big, huge, scary deal. And what could possibly, counterbalance this terror I'm going through at the moment? But then you've got a whole rest of your life where you're not going to get sick, and that counterbalances the momentary terror. Well, compared to an infinite future of happiness, this life is just a moment. And so no matter how bad it is in this moment, it's even if your whole life was nothing but suffering, it's finite. And you've got an infinite future with God of happiness that it will, the infinite by definition counterbalances the finite. So you're going to end up, as St. Paul says, with this great weight of glory, compared to which the sufferings of this life are not worth comparing. So one thing that's important to remember is that even if things seem bad now, this life is not the end. And we need to think in terms of the overall perspective that God is using to evaluate the relative weights of different things. And from that eternal perspective, where we get eternal happiness as part of the bargain, that kind of lets you tolerate a notable amount of evil if it's in service of getting to that ultimate infinite happiness.
One common objection to Christianity is the concept of the Trinity, with many people finding it difficult to understand. Additionally, other religions such as Islam have a differing view of this doctrine. How would you explain the Trinity to someone who is not familiar with Christianity?
Well, so there's sort of two levels on which one could do this. The first level is, why would you believe it? And that's a matter of going through the Bible and showing the various texts that imply the different aspects of the Trinity. The second level is a conceptual one of, what does it mean? And it is difficult to conceptualize because we're dealing with something that's on the edge of human consciousness. And it's actually, trying to understand God who is infinitely above us. If we did understand him, that would actually be a little suspicious, because a being that's infinitely above us, there's going to be things about that being that just seem strange and that are hard to understand. If you think you understand God perfectly, and it's like, oh yeah, no problem. You're probably simplifying God. You're probably oversimplifying him. So I don't think it's surprising that there are things that are difficult for us to fully conceptualize. Like, for example, in mathematics, we can understand the principles of a hypercube, which is a four-dimensional cube, but we can't visualize one. You can visualize a point or a line or a square or a cube in your mind, but you can't, and you can describe those shapes mathematically. A line has a length of S, let's say. A square has an area of S to the power of 2, or s squared. A cube has a volume of s to the power of 3, or s cubed. And it's real easy to infer, therefore a 4-dimensional square is going to have a hypervolume of s to the 4th power. So we can understand that, the mathematics of a hypercube, but we can't understand what it looks like. About the closest we can do is use these shapes that are really, some of them, they look kind of like a cube inside of a cube. You'll sometimes hear them called tesseracts. And those are really 3-dimensional shadows of a 4-dimensional cube. They're not a real hypercube. We can't imagine one because our minds are constructed to work in 3 dimensions, not in 4. But that doesn't stop us from understanding the mathematics of a hypercube. In the same way, we can understand the essence of the Trinity without being able to fully visualize and comprehend it. So the way I tend to do that is with a simple illustration. The idea that God is a Trinity can be expressed as God is one being who is 3 persons. Now, being and person are different categories. A being, to borrow from Black American English, is anything that bees. If it exists, it's a being. So I'm a being, you are a being, my desk is a being, my microphone is a being, angels are beings, God is a being, all of us together, we be. So we're beings. But not all of us are persons. My desk and my microphone are not persons. They are 0 persons. But you and I, we're persons. I'm one person. You're one person. So this shows us that being and person are different categories. So if some beings are impersonal, meaning they're 0 persons, like my desk and my microphone, and if some beings are personal, meaning they're one person, like you and me, then there's no logical reason why some beings can't be suprapersonal, meaning more than one person. And that's what biblical revelation reveals about God. He is a suprapersonal being. He's a being that exists, but he's also 3 persons. Now, that's a basic presentation of the Trinity. It doesn't allow us to fully imagine the Trinity, even, just like we can't fully imagine a hypercube. But we can understand the basics of the Trinity just like we can understand the basics of a hypercube. And so there's obviously more to say there, but keeping it within a Q&A format, that's how I'd explain it.
Recently, I had some conversations with some Protestant pastors, and I was trying to get their opinion on if they think that Jesus, the Father, and the Holy Spirit, if they all have separate minds. Would you agree with that? That they have separate minds?
That is something that I have not looked at carefully enough. So at this point, I wouldn't express an opinion on that. Now, obviously, Jesus has a human intellect in addition to his divine intellect. But the question of do the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all share one divine intellect, or is there something distinct here? That is a subtler question that I've heard people express opinions about, but I've not seen a definitive church teaching on that, and I have not investigated it thoroughly, so I'll have to leave that for now. As Ludwig Wittgenstein said, that which we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence.
Another question that people kind of disagree on in the Christian church on different denominations is when, Jesus died on the cross, was he separated from the Father? And if he was, for how long?
Well, so my basic answer is going to be no, but he wasn't separated from the Father. But before I can really say that as a conclusion, I have to ask a clarifying question: is what do you mean by separated? Because obviously his divine nature, he that can't be separated from the divine nature of the Father. Because the divine nature is immutable. It cannot change. And so therefore he can't be separated from the Father in his divine nature. Did he cease to be a human? Was his human nature separated? No, it wasn't. What was separated was his human body and his human soul. Because as James 2 says, the body without the spirit is dead. And well, he died, so his human body and his human spirit separated from each other. But if you want to propose he was separated in some further manner from the Father, well, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I didn't agree with that because I thought if they were ever separated, then I guess the Trinity would collapse and the world would probably collapse. I guess their argument is that if Jesus encountered death, I guess death means that's a separation.
Yeah, of body and spirit, and that happened to Jesus. His human body and his human spirit separated for 3 days. But that doesn't separate either one from the Father. The Father is the Lord of creation. He created, Christ's human spirit and Christ's human body, and so they continued to exist. Neither one of them winked out of existence. They were still part of God's creation. He wasn't separated from the Father in that way. What some people who use language like this, and I can imagine several different kinds of people using this language. I can imagine, for example, people who believe in what's known as penal substitution as a theory of atonement might use this language. Also, people in the word faith movement might use this language, and they might mean different things by it. In terms of people who believe in penal substitution, that's the idea that God was punishing Jesus on the cross, that he was pouring out his wrath on Jesus. And so if I could imagine someone who believes in penal substitution thinking that there was an emotional separation, like God literally emotionally abandoned Jesus and then in anger poured out his wrath on him. And I would say that's all that's a mistake. Penal substitution is not well grounded in Scripture. There is only one passage. Penal substitutionists will appeal to different passages, but when you look at them, there's really only one. It's in the Suffering Servant song in Isaiah. There's only one that actually uses language connected with wrath and so forth, and that's a poetic passage because it's prophecy. It's not a theological statement. It's a prophetic, poetic statement. And so you have to be careful about, is this language meant to be literal or not? And if you've only got one passage and it's a poetic one, that's not a good basis for a doctrine that says the infinite, all-holy God, the Father, literally punishes the infinitely good Son. That would seem to be manifestly unjust. You can't literally punish someone who is innocent. It is unjust to do that. And furthermore, these two persons are both love. I mean, we're told God is love. How does love pour out anger on love? That doesn't make any sense. So, I think that rather than penal substitution, the more historic theories of the atonement, which we can go into or not if you want, like vicarious satisfaction and Christ the victor and sacrifice and so forth, those are the superior ways to understand the atonement. And similarly, like when Jesus says on the cross, "Father, Father, why have you abandoned me?" He's actually quoting the first line of Psalm 22. And when you read Psalm 22, it's clear that even though at the beginning of the psalm, the psalmist is sounding like he's been abandoned by God, by the end of it, you realize he actually hadn't been abandoned by God. God is going to vindicate him. And so by just quoting the first line, while he's being crucified and suffering and not able to recite the whole psalm, Jesus is gesturing to Psalm 22 saying, it may look like God has abandoned me, but guess what? He's going to vindicate me. So I'd have to know more about what does someone mean when they say the Father and the Son were separated. But my fundamental answer, unless they come up with an interpretation I'm not thinking of, would be no, they weren't literally separated.
Yeah, it's just when I've watched some sermons throughout the years, some pastors use the term "the Father damned the Son,"
Yeah.
and I just never understood that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that's where my question was coming from.
Yeah, there are some even more extreme theories that you'll get in the word faith movement, where you'll say some word faith teachers will say, like, Jesus went to the literal hell of the damned and died and was reborn as this little worm spirit and then came back, and it's even weirder.
What's hiding in the Vatican secret archives?
Well, it's not really, hiding is not really a word I would use for it, but what has not yet been disclosed is the material from the most recent pontificates. Because what they do, and by the way, these days it's been renamed because secreto means something different in Italian than it does in English. So to end the confusion, they've renamed it as the Vatican Apostolic Archives. It's no longer called the Secret Archives. Secreto, it just meant private. It didn't mean we're hiding stuff in here. It just meant these are the private archives. But because of the confusion it caused, they've now changed the name. And they're not that secret. They're not secret in the American sense. You can go look at them. They'll bring up the stuff for you. All you got to do is fill out a form to get a library card, basically. They want, as part of that process, and by the way, I have an episode of Mysterious World on the Secret Archives. Let me get you the number. It is episode 147, so listeners can go to mysterious.fm/147 and learn all about it. But basically, you apply for a library card by filling out a form. They want to see that you either are, because these are a historical archive, they want to see that you either are a historian or that you are working for a historian or you're doing some kind of historical project. And so they want to know that. They don't want to know what faith you are. They don't care. You can be an atheist, you can be a Muslim, you can be a Catholic, you can be a Protestant, you can be anything. They just want to know you're doing legitimate historical research. And then you tell them what you want, and you go over there, and they look up the boxes, and they bring them up to you, and you can read them. And you can request almost anything that is there. They typically will not grant is the documentation from the most recent pontificates. I forget the exact number of years, but they wait a certain number of years before they make those available for the public. It's something like 75 years or something like that. The reason they do that is because they want to protect people's privacy, because these documents mention, individuals and claims about individuals that may or may not be true. And they cover private things like, get given dispensations from, weird marital situations that involve very private, sensitive matters between the couples. And so to protect people's privacy, they wait till they're all dead. And so they don't release stuff until a certain number of decades have passed. The most recent full release, they may release some things, from a pontiff's reign early, but they don't release everything until a substantial amount of time has passed. The current pontiff who's had everything released is Pius XII, who, so that's, you basically got everything up through 1958. And then the stuff since then, they release some of it, but not other bits because it's more private. They also tend to not release exorcism cases, again, because of privacy concerns. Even if something is older, you still don't want, what goes on in exorcism cases can be really sensitive. And so they tend not to release a lot of that material either. But other than that, you can ask for anything you want.
Have you ever checked out a book there?
No, I haven't ever been. I tend to do my research at a distance. I would have to fly over to Rome and and deal with Italy, which is its own challenge. And it's a nice place to visit, but I haven't had a project that I've been working on that's required me to go over there. But I have looked up the form, to see, well, here's what I would need to do. I've just never actually done it myself.
Who are the Nephilim, or also pronounced Nephilim? How do the interpretations of the Nephilim differ across various religious traditions, and what might these differences reveal about cultural beliefs regarding giants and fallen angels?
Okay, so first off, it's nice you pronounced it both ways. The Hebrew way of pronouncing it would be Nephilim or Nephilim. Hebrew, unlike English, likes to put the accent on the last syllable, on the ultima. So anytime you're looking at a Hebrew word and you're trying to guess, how do I pronounce this? You want to stress that last syllable, Nephilim. English doesn't do that. English tends to put it earlier in the word. So what are they? Well, they're mentioned in Genesis 6. They're also mentioned in a few other places. They're mentioned in Numbers, and they're mentioned in some extra biblical literature from the Second Temple period. The meaning of the term is often given as fallen ones, based on a related Hebrew word that can mean to fall. But this appears to be an inaccurate translation, because the way Hebrew words work, if it was based on the word for to fall, it wouldn't be Nephilim, it would be Nophilim. And so you can tell by the form of the word, it doesn't look like it's coming from the Hebrew word. So what else might it mean? Well, it might be a loan word from Aramaic, which is a related language to Hebrew. In fact, some of the Old Testament is written in Aramaic. So this could be a loan word, and in Aramaic, Nephilim would mean giants. And that's also what the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, has in this passage. It says, so in the Hebrew text, it says that the sons of God married the daughters of men, and to them were born the Nephilim. So the Nephilim, whatever they are, they appear to be the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. And in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, what it says is that instead of Nephilim, because that's a Semitic word, it uses a Greek word, and the Greek word it uses is gigantes, giants. And so we've got confirmation from the Greek Old Testament that it looks like these are to be understood as giants. Now, giant doesn't mean what you and I might think of as a giant. It just means someone who's bigger than normal. But normal is not the same 3,000 years ago when Genesis was written as it is today, because their nutrition was different. In fact, I was, even in the time of the Civil War, the American Civil War, the average soldier was something like 5'4", 5'5", and we're considerably taller than that now. Well, the same thing was true in the ancient world. In 1000 BC, the average Israelite was between 5 feet and 5'6". So they're considerably shorter than we are. But some peoples are taller than others. Like, in Africa, Watusis are taller than Pygmies. And in Europe, Dutch people are taller than Italians. So you don't have to be super, super giant. If you're 6 foot, you would be considered a giant in the ancient world. And I happen to be 6 foot, so I would be considered a giant.
6'2".
What's that?
I'm 6'2".
There you go. You'd be even more giant. So you don't want to think of a giant as something that's multi times the size of a human. Having said that, we want to figure out, okay, so what are the sons of God and what are the daughters of men? Well, there have been different theories. One theory that you'll hear a lot of today is that the sons of God were the righteous line of Seth, because you had these, Adam has the two sons. He's got Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and then you get this later line of Sethites who come from their third son, Seth. And they're portrayed in Genesis as kind of a good line. So maybe the sons of God are the line of Seth. And this is known as the Sethite interpretation. And then the women they're marrying, if they're not Sethites, they'd have to be from the line of Cain, the other surviving line that gets mentioned. Okay, maybe. That's one theory. Another theory would say that the sons of God are like leaders, that they are priests or kings or priest kings, because priest kings were a thing in the ancient world. Pharaoh in Egypt, he's not just the king of Egypt, he's the high priest of Egypt. Melchizedek of Jerusalem, he's just not king of Jerusalem, he's the high priest of Jerusalem. So maybe the sons of God are like priest kings, and they marry the daughters of men, then would be the common women, and they marry them. Okay, another possible theory. So those are two that you hear today, and what they have in common is they make the sons of God humans. Whether they're Sethites or whether they're priest kings, they're humans. But this is not the oldest interpretation. If you look, this is a later interpretation that you find later in the history of commentaries in Jewish and Christian circles. You go back to the earliest comment we have on this passage, and it interprets the sons of God as angels. And so the idea is that angels came down and had children with human women, and being hybrids, they weren't exactly like angels and they weren't exactly like humans. They were like larger than normal humans. And this is the interpretation we find widespread in the earliest literature dealing with this. This is in a lot of Second Temple literature. It's in the Book of Jubilees. It's in the Book of First Enoch. It's in other works from this period. And it also precedes, seems to precede, factors of it precede into Mesopotamian literature that's older than Genesis. So I actually have a Mysterious World episode about this. I'll get you that number. I actually have one on giants. The one on giants is episode 243. So that's at mysterious.fm/243. But then the one on the Nephilim is episode 87. So that's mysterious.fm/87. And I think that just taking this as a literary text and trying to figure out what was the author trying to communicate, as opposed to what do I think actually happened literally, I think that the angelic interpretation is correct. That this is referring to a group of angels because that's what Son of God means elsewhere when it gets used this way. We have a clear contrast between sons of God and daughters of men. That suggests that the sons come from God and the daughters come from men. So the sons are heavenly beings. They are not humans. If they're Sethites or if they're priest kings, why are the daughters called daughters of men? They should be daughters of Cain or daughters of commoners or something like that. The fact they're called daughters of men suggests they're human, in contrast to the sons of God. And we see the term sons of God being used for heavenly beings that today we would call angels. For example, in the book of Job, where we've got that Freeman narrative at the beginning of the book, where we're up in heaven and God comes in and the sons of God come in and Satan comes in and they start talking about Job down on earth, and that leads to the whole book. But the sons of God are God's heavenly court. They're high-ranking angels. And we similarly see the same concept used elsewhere in the New Testament, like in Deuteronomy, where it says, when God divided up the nations, so this is the Tower of Babel incident, that's where they all get divided by language. When God divided up the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. So he put each nation under a different angelic being, but he kept Israel for himself as his own heritage. And so that's how Israel is different than the nations. And we see these same entities referred to later, like in the book of Daniel, where at one point Daniel is praying for 3 weeks, and finally Gabriel shows up with a vision. And Gabriel says, "Hey, Daniel, sorry I'm late. I heard you 3 weeks ago. I would have been here sooner, but the prince of Persia resisted me." So he's talking about the angelic ruler of the Persian Empire. He's not talking about the human. He's talking about the angel, the power behind the throne of Persia. He says, "The prince of Persia resisted me, and there was no one with me until Michael, the prince of your people." So Michael is the angelic prince of Israel. "Until Michael came to help me, and right now he's got the prince of Persia in headlock to allow me to get through and give you this revelation. And then once I'm done giving you this revelation, I'm going to go back, and Michael and I are going to whale the tar out of the prince of Persia. He's going to lose power, and then after that, the prince of Greece is going to arise." So we have this glimpse into this world of angelic conflict over the fates of the nations, where you have angelic rulers of Persia and Greece who have gone bad because they're opposing God's will, and you have good ones like Gabriel and Michael who are executing God's will by engaging in battle with these so they can, among other things, get messages through to the prophets. So I think the angelic interpretation is the one that is it's what is in the author of Genesis's mind. Now, that's a separate question than what's literally true here, because as Pope Pius XII acknowledged, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which is where this is found, they do contain historical information, but it's presented in a way that incorporates symbolism. He referred to it as simple and metaphorical language adapted to the mentality of a people but little cultured, because the Israelites at 1000 BC, they're not super cultured yet. And so it contains real information, but that is presented in a way that incorporates a good deal of symbolism. So we have to be careful in terms of how much of this do we take literally. But that's what I would have to say about the Nephilim.
What is the reasoning behind praying to the saints? Why is it beneficial to pray to the saints when we can communicate directly with God?
Well, so let me turn it around. Do you ever ask other human beings here on earth to pray for you?
I do.
Okay. Why do you do that if you can just pray directly to God? What benefit do you get by having other humans praying for you?
It does say that, if someone that's godly, if they pray for you, it's beneficial.
Yep. As James says, the prayer of a righteous man avails much. So, who's more righteous than our fellow Christians who are actually in heaven and no longer tempted in any way by sin? Anyone more righteous than them? I wouldn't think so. I can't think of anybody. Certainly nobody down here on earth. So, I think it's God's will that Christians pray for each other, and he will grant certain prayers when multiple people are praying. The reason I think he wants us to pray for each other is the same reason I think he wants us to pray, period. Because Jesus makes the point, you're not giving God any information when you pray. He already knows what you need. The reason you're praying is not to give God information, and he already loves you. So why would God want you to pray to him if he doesn't need the information? Well, it's not to help God, it's to help you. Because what prayer does is it gets you thinking about your dependency on God and your need for God and how you need him and how he gives you good things. So it encourages you to fulfill the first great commandment, love of God. Prayer gives you an opportunity to grow in love for God. Why then would God want people down here on earth to pray for each other? Well, because if I'm praying for my neighbor, I'm loving my neighbor. I'm asking for good things to be done for my neighbor. And that's what the essence of love is. It's not a feeling, it's willing the good of another. And so I'm willing the good of another by praying for him. And so that fulfills the second great commandment, love your neighbor. So God, the whole purpose behind prayer is it facilitates love. It facilitates love of God. It facilitates love of neighbor. And to encourage us to do those things, God has decided that he will incentivize us by granting certain requests, provided we pray for them, both to him and for each other. So that's why it's beneficial to pray in general, because it builds up the Christian community in love, and because God chooses to reward that buildup in love by granting certain requests. In particular, we're told that righteous people have extra power in their prayers, meaning God grants their requests even more often, no doubt, as an incentive to be loving, righteous people. He grants their requests even more. So if no one is more righteous than the people who are up in heaven and are already perfectly holy, then it makes sense to ask them to be our prayer partners too. So that's a basic sketch of the dynamics of prayer and why God wants us to do it and how it benefits us, and how those who are up in heaven fit into all that, because they're fellow Christians too. They can be our prayer partners too. They're even more righteous than we are, and it causes us to grow in love for them and to imitate their examples if we're asking them to be our prayer partners and God's helping us out. Incidentally, angels do the same thing. In fact, coming out, I guess it's coming out in 2 weeks on the Jimmy Akin podcast, which is not the same as Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, but you can also find it at my YouTube channel. I've got a look at how angels are believed to pray for us, and this is a widespread belief. This is in the Old Testament, that angels intercede for humans. It's in Second Temple literature, and it's in the New Testament. And so I walk you through the different texts talking about angels interceding for human beings.
Can I pray to anyone that I think is in heaven?
Sure, why not?
Okay. So basically, they're more alive in Christ and they're more holy than we are. Is that the argument too?
Well, I've heard some folks say they're more alive in Christ. That's meant as kind of a rebuttal to the "but they're dead," and people will use "but they're more alive in Christ than we are" as kind of a squelch. I don't really use that one. I mean, it's true they're alive in Christ, but just because they're dead, that doesn't mean that doesn't. So what? Yeah, they're dead. Their bodies are separated from their spirits. It doesn't mean they've ceased to exist. The Bible shows spirits in the afterlife that are praying for things happening on earth. So that's in the book of Revelation, for example. So I don't care. If you want to say they're dead, well, yeah, they are. I don't care. If their spirits are still around. Their spirits are in contact with God. They're praying for things down here on earth. I'm just asking them to pray alongside me.
Who would you recommend to pray to?
Well, so it's going to depend. I mean, a lot of Christians have wanted to pray to the Virgin Mary because she's Jesus's mom. So, okay, that makes sense. But you can also pray to anybody you want. I'm a widower, and so sometimes I've prayed to my deceased wife, because she knows me, she's concerned about me, and so it would make sense for her to pray for me for, at least some things. Also, if you can think of someone who's in heaven who would have an interest in praying for something, well, it's logical to approach that person. Like, for example, after my wife died, I was lonely. I wanted to get remarried. And so I thought, that happened with Abraham in the Old Testament. He's first married to Sarah, but then when she dies, he gets remarried to a woman named Keturah. So Abraham knew what it was like to be a widower and want to get remarried. And so I could pray to Abraham and, help me find a new wife. Unfortunately, I haven't, but, it made sense to think of him in that regard. People in various places have also appealed um, to individuals that would reasonably have an interest in them. Like, for example, back in the 300s, the Bishop of Milan, Italy, was St. Ambrose. And so it became natural for the people of Milan to ask St. Ambrose after he was died to pray for them, because he had been their bishop. He had a concern for the people of Milan. So he became their patron saint. That's where patron saints come from. You have some reason to think that someone would have an interest in this, so people start asking for that person to pray for this, and that's how you get a patron saint. I happened to, I was asked recently by a local park here in Arkansas, a state park, to do artillery demonstrations, like using Civil War cannons and stuff. And so I've been doing that. And it turns out that St. Barbara is the patron saint of artillerymen. So even though they're not all Catholic, the people in my group, they'll all have little St. Barbara medals because people ask her to pray for artillerymen. And so it depends on who you think of, or if you can't think of anybody else, you can always just ask, all the saints and angels, please pray for me.
Okay. I'm assuming Mary would get the most requests. She probably gets millions of requests.
Yep.
So how does Mary hear or have the capability to listen to everyone's prayers?
So there's normally, it's not only listen, but also how does she respond to so many prayers? So I'll try to answer both of those for you. The first one is, it's not clear how they know what our prayers are. The common theological opinion is, this is, for example, what St. Thomas Aquinas says. He says God tells them that, part of being happy in heaven is having all of the information that pertains to you. So if someone wants your intercession, well, that's information that pertains to you. And being a loving person, you're going to want to pray for that individual. So you need to know about it. And so God just tells you, and you see the information in God. So God is serving effectively as kind of an internet router for prayers. Well, that's one possibility. It certainly could work that way. God is omniscient. He knows what everybody's prayers are, so he can route them to people if that's how it needs to happen. I wonder, could there be something else, though? Like I mentioned, Father Alois Weissinger's proposal that what psychic functioning is the remnants of our preternatural gifts. Well, if you're up in heaven, you may have some of those gifts back. So you may have functional telepathy at that point. And if someone is reaching out to you, you may know it. So I would consider that a possibility too, but I know it would work if God wants to do it. So that's in terms of how the information gets to them. Then there's another question of how would they respond to so many requests? And I think there are a number of possibilities there. One possibility is they respond in a generic way. It's like if I know there are times where people have made prayer requests of me and I can't remember them all. But I will say to God, for everyone who's asked me for their prayers, I want to pray for them. Even if I can't think of them specifically at this moment, I can still pray for them. I can just do it in a generic way. And even if Mary is like crushed and overloaded by, millions of prayers all at once, she can still say, Father, please help all of the people who have asked for my prayers. Just one generic prayer, that'll do it. And God knows who she means, and it's all dependent on God's generosity anyway. So, that could be one way it could be done. But I don't think it's the only way. That's kind of the minimal way of her responding to the prayer requests. I think it's quite possible that there is a greater response because God is going to give us an intellect boost in the afterlife. I mean, already we see in the Bible, like Balaam's ass, it's a donkey. And yet God gives it a temporary intellect boost so that it's able to speak with him. Well, okay, there's nothing there that involves a logical contradiction, so that's within God's power to do. And if he can do it with Balaam's ass, he can do it with one of us. He can give us whatever processing power we need in the afterlife to deal with whatever requests are coming in. And in parapsychology, one of the areas that's very closely studied is the survival of bodily death. And since the 1970s, there's been a lot of research done on what are known as near-death experiences, or NDEs, that have certain common characteristics. You know, someone's heart stops, they go into cardiac arrest, they have these experiences, they come back and they're able to talk about them. So what kind of experiences do they report? Well, among other things, they sometimes report knowing vast amounts of information that they can't bring back with them when their heart gets restarted. But they report, yeah, I knew all the mysteries of the universe. All I had to do was think about a subject and I would instantly know everything about it. Well, that would suggest that having a big information boost and a big intellect boost may be part of what God has in store for us in the afterlife. So if these near-death experience accounts are true or accurate, then okay, that would suggest all Mary has to do is think about whoever's praying for me, and instantly she understands it all and can pray for those people. So I think that's a possibility as well. Also, sometimes they will say time didn't quite work the way there that it does here. My perception of time was different. And that's actually similar to theological speculation by some of the medieval theologians like Aquinas, that time will not work exactly the same way in the afterlife that it does here. It's going to have certain characteristics of regular time. It's going to have certain characteristics of eternity. And so they called it aveternity to distinguish it from true timelessness or eternity. So if time works different in the afterlife, then you got a million prayer requests. Well, great. You got all the time you need to handle with them. So between the information boost and time working differently, I don't see that there's any, in principle, problem here.
I don't know if we have time for one last question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, one last question. Did Mary have birth pains?
This is something that there is a division of opinion on. The church does not have a formal teaching on this. People often infer that she didn't, because in Genesis 3, it says, God says to Eve, I will multiply your pains in childbearing. And a lot of people look at that and they take that as evidence that women would not have any pains if they were unfallen. In fact, that is the way that it was taken by the author of a first century document known as The Life of Adam and Eve. But it's not actually what it says in Hebrew. What it says in Hebrew is, I will multiply your pains in childbearing. And that could mean that Eve would have had some pain in childbearing, just not as much as after the fall. So then people reason, excuse me, we've been going a couple hours. I need to hydrate a little bit. But people reason, well, okay, Eve wouldn't have had pains if she had not fallen, and Mary is unfallen by God's grace. She's not touched by original sin because she was redeemed by Christ in an even more spectacular way than we are, and so she wouldn't have pains given birth to Jesus. And that's a reasonable line of inference, but it's not guaranteed, because for two reasons. Number one, if Eve would have had at least some birth pains, then even if Mary is in the same unfallen state as Eve, she could have some birth pains. They just wouldn't have been as severe. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, even though Mary is not touched by original sin, that doesn't mean that she has all of the same gifts that Eve did. Just like the fact that Jesus is unfallen as well doesn't mean that he was living in a paradisical environment. You know, Jesus could and did suffer and die. And that's In fact, why he came was to die on the cross. So Mary could suffer and die as well. And as part of that, as part of not living in the Garden of Eden, well, maybe that's connected to the labor pains. And so Mary might have had labor pains in that way. So I think it's an open question. Having said all that, the idea that she did not have labor pains is astonishingly early. It is mentioned as early as AD 67. It is mentioned for example, in an early Christian apocalypse known as the Ascension of Isaiah. And this document was written, it appears, in AD 67 because it mentions the death of Peter, which likely occurred in AD 66, but it also mentions that Nero is still alive, and Nero committed suicide in June of 68. So it looks like it's written between Peter's death in 66 and Nero's suicide in 68, so you can estimate that it was written in AD 67, 34 years after the crucifixion. And in the course of the book, it talks about Mary giving birth to Jesus in a miraculous way that did not involve pain. She and Joseph have been living under the same roof for 2 months. They're sitting at home one day. She's big with child. There's this brilliant light, and all of a sudden she's holding the baby, and her womb is as it was before. She's not pregnant anymore. And so she has this miraculous, painless birth. And this is not the only story like this. From the early church. We have the same thing in the 2nd century document known as the Infancy Gospel of James, or the Proto-Evangelium of James. So as early as the 2nd and even the 1st century, we have reports of Mary experiencing a miraculous birth that did not involve pain. So even though I would say it's an open question, I would also say we've got really astonishingly early claims that it was painless.
Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure. And if you'd like me to come on and talk about more stuff, always happy to do that.
I would love to get more into the theology side too sometime.